The smell of old paper and beeswax wrapped itself around him like a confession, and for a moment Alin thought he could drown in that memory of safety, the smell threading through the corridors of his childhood like a secret nobody wanted to keep. Light pooled on the edges of the library table, thin and hesitant, and the portraits along the wall watched him with painted patience, each face a promise that had failed to arrive. He had learned early that fairs and stories were dishonest, that when people spoke of heirs and legacies, they were really naming ledgers and risks, and that the sweetest lullabies could hide the blade of calculation beneath their rhythm. It was in the sterile cool of the maester's chamber that the lie of belonging finally split open. The maester's hands were both clinical and tender as they recorded numbers, as if comfort could be typed into a ledger. And when the tests finished, he said the words that had the weight of law: infertile, hollow, unable to bear fruit for the lineage. They called it with a dozen euphemisms at court, a litany of polite cruelty, but in the kitchen and in his mouth the true name was simpler and sharper: abandoned. The father who once promised to teach him to ride looked like a man who had been asked to choose between two coins, and the mother who had braided his hair placed her palms over her face as if she could feel shame like heat. The guardian Denia, rigid and immaculate even in grief, tied the last knot of the veil he would wear for the public verification, as if sealing a document. And the maester Elias, with the ache of a man who had read too many failed pages, murmured that kingdoms were pragmatic things. The verdict was not only medical, it was political. A body that failed to deliver heirs became a ledger item to be traded. They called it verification. Alin called it exile. But a message arrived with the odor of cold iron and pressed seals from a northern court wrapped in clouds and myth, an offer wrapped in statistics and necessity. Ambassador Corin, with a voice smooth as lacquer, explained on the raised dais that the House Varnick sought mates not for fruit but for safety, that their king was afflicted in the opposite way to Alin's emptiness. His touch blighted what he loved. It sounded clinical, improbable, and yet in that room the terms tasted like inevitability. The proposal was clear: a binding alliance, a marriage not for children but for balance. For a kingdom who feared the warmth of life, someone like Alin was a political commodity. He felt the heat of a thing like shame and a curious ember of curiosity. Perhaps, he thought with a small private revolt, the thing that had rendered him worthless at home might be worth something beyond those walls. Narration would remain close to Alin, third person, intimate, and merciless, but with the rare bloom of his first-person confessions as the story demanded, and so the journey began with a goodbye that was more ledger than blessing, and with furniture and a single trunk he left the place that had named him empty. The word malediction hung in the air like a scent, an accusation and a myth, and the citadel that awaited in the north was described in the ambassador's letter by terms straight from the codices: obsidian ramparts, a king who was called Alpha for the command in his voice, lands that consumed light, a throne that never knew laughter. Secondary figures took shape around him almost at once, each casting a different shade on his exile. Denia, the guardian, who measured loyalty like paperweights. Maester Elias, who kept the instruments of truth in a chest lined with lavender to remember gentleness. Ambassador Corin, whose hands arranged destinies as one arranges maps. Lady Maris, a cousin in the household who hid pity behind parasites of jewelry. Captain Var, in whose stead Alin would later confide on the road. Scribe Jalin, who copied names and rumors with the diligence of a monk. Sister Thera, who ran the herbery like a liturgy. And court physician Rodek, whose face seemed carved by winters. Each of them would act and react, conspiring or shrinking, whispering or striking, a small constellation drawn around Alin and the problem of what to do with a body that did not bear fruit. The first scene, the examination and the exile, expanded into a ritual of small cruel gestures that felt like a church service for the dispossessed. There, the maester unfolded cloths that smelled of iron, the stethoscope a cold mouth on his ribs, and the public verification unfolded with an audience of relatives who were both litigious and pious. The sounds were subtle and precise, the scratch of a quill on parchment, the faint rattle of a window latch, the low hum of a servant's lamp, the sight of silk where once there had been laughter, the salt of his mother's tears on her upper lip, the bruise of silence in the dining hall like a husk. Dialogues in that first crucial scene spun out so that each voice would be heard and each motive made visible. There were exchanges that echoed one another like a small choir of accusation and excuse. "We thought there might be a treatment," his mother insisted, voice thin. "We sought every sage," Danya replied, hands folded with the exactitude of ritual. "It is not cruelty to be practical," Ambassador Corin observed, as if announcing the weather. "Practicality is what kills tenderness," Alin answered, the sentence small and sharp. "You will be safe," Maester Elias promised, and then later, "Safe is also a kind of cage," Alin said. And the lines kept returning, the dialogue expanding and splitting into different registers, until the scene had 10 exchanges and then more, each actor revealing character with short breaths.
Sensations accumulated. The must of vellum, the taste of iron in his mouth, the scraping of a chair on stone, the way velvet swallowed sound, the sting of cold on his calves when he left the hall, and the echo of the maester's peas as if closing a chapter. That first block closed with the offer sealed by Corin, an alliance with a king who had been named Alpha by his people for the raw authority of his presence. The journey north began with a small caravan that smelled of horse sweat and thyme, and Captain Var's boots kept a rhythm that mimicked a clock as they crossed mountain passes where wind spoke in brittle tongues. The road was a catalogue of small sensations: the sting of cold on his cheeks, the sour tang of preserved meat in the trough, the roughness of a woolen cloak that Denya insisted he keep buttoned to hide his thinness, the metallic hum of the barracks when they halted at night. Alin learned the names of other passengers, their histories laid out like poor maps. Scribe Jalin, with ink-stained fingers, who told a story about a burned archive and refused to meet the topic of his own loss. Sister Thera, who fed them stewed roots and herbs and hummed fragments of liturgy to keep night at bay. Lady Maris, who practiced smiles in the reflection of her spoons. The journey's dialogues opened like doors, and at the arrival near the citadel, an envoy of the north received them with a silence that was a test. The citadel looked like a wound in the sky, walls of dark glass that drank the sun, and the first taste of its air made Alin's mouth feel scaled with frost. There was an initial reception with a guard of granite, and a steward named Joran led them through corridors that smelled of wax and ash, where tapestries were woven with the images of beasts and vows. The first glimpses of the Alpha King were oblique, a presence in the entrance hall that moved like slow weather, the sound of boots on stone, the way air seemed to bend around him as if refusing to cross a threshold. The court had its own liturgy, a cold iron bureaucracy that catalogued guests and assigned rooms with the precision of a hospital, and the first official meeting with the king was formal and clinical. Dialogues in these scenes were trim, full of courtesy that disguised hunger, with at least 10 exchanges between Alin, Ambassador Corin, the steward, and the king's aide, Captain Var, on logistics, safety, and expectation. "We do not bind this lightly," Captain Var said, voice like a stone grinding. "Then do not bind it at all," Alin replied, testing the voice that the house had taught him. "The king will accept only what the law allows," the steward countered. "Law and mercy are different things," he said. The steward's paper rustled. The king's envoy watched
him as if measuring his blood for weight, and all the small sensory details piled into a tapestry, the hiss of a brazier, the sharpness of icicle air that tasted like copper, the way light fractured on obsidian walls like scattered stars, the damp stain of moss in a corridor, the soft, almost undetectable perfume of a servant's scarf. The Alpha King himself revealed more in absence than in presence. He entered a room like a tide, and when he finally spoke, his voice was not thunderous, but inexorable. He was known as Krell Varnek, a sovereign whose touch was rumor and curse, who had been called Alpha not only for command, but because his people's old tales said he could compel growth through risk, and that his hands had once healed and once scorched. Krell's backstory unfolded in a series of clinical fragments and mythic asides. As a boy, he had ruled with a sternness born of fear, rearing frost where hearths should be warm, because the earliest healing his hands had brought had killed rather than mended. He was a man who had been taught to measure his worth in rivers of yield and blight, shaped by frost and by the careful cruelty of advisors who preferred predictability to compassion. He had a habit of touching objects and watching the air around them dull, and though rumor softened this into legend, Roddick, the court physician, catalogued incidents in notes so clinical they read like field reports. His backstory, about 700 characters in breadth, described a childhood of rooms with closed shutters, tutors with strict hands, and a mother who taught him the art of restraint. He learned early to control the impulse to reach, to command rather than to caress, and those lessons had forged the man who would later sit across from Alin and accept an alliance because it promised a balance to his own curse. The first week in the Citadel was a study in isolation disguised as hospitality. Alin's chamber was opulent and solitary, the bed large and empty like a stage set, the curtains heavy with the smell of resin, and he bathed in water that left him smelling faintly of iron and lavender. Dinners were organized and cold, as if a meal were a decree, with carved foods placed with the mechanical politeness of courtly machines, and conversation traded in scripts. Denya remained a constant, watching with the same expression one keeps for a veteran patient, and Roddick visited with instruments wrapped in cloth to avoid terrifying him with the clang of knowledge. The sensory register here was dense, the clink of silverware like tiny metronomes, the bitter herbal aftertaste of medicines passed as hospitality, the way his palms felt perpetually numb as if waiting for a shock, the subdued silk of the king's banners that smelled like an old chapel, the whisper of servant slippers on flagstones at midnight. Among the court, reactions to Alin varied. Lady Maris simpered and offered small, injudicious comforts. Scribe Jalen watched with the hunger of someone noting a scandal for future gossip. Captain Var made a point of escorting him on walks, while Sister Thera slipped him a pouch of seeds and murmured that some things need dark to root. The routine multiplied into modes of small cruelty, quiet tests, and ritualized loneliness. It was in the greenhouse, the serre, a hidden conservatory beneath the citadel where glass caught light and plants clung to warmth, that the first anomaly happened. The greenhouse was a secret place. It smelled of damp earth and green leaves, of peat and the faint sweet rot that hides in rich soil. Here, away from the observant eyes of the court, Alin found a sprig of rosemary that had been replanted in a pot and yet shimmered with a pale pulse under his touch. It should have been dead, a clipped specimen left for study. Yet when his gloves brushed the leaf, a small quiver ran up the stem, and a green bead of sap swelled and shone like a secret jewel. He whispered, half to himself, and felt something answer, as if the plant had been waiting for a name. The king, who later arrived to inspect the serre, watched the exchange with a face so inscrutable it was a mask. Roddick, who had been sent to catalog the court's botanical experiments, noted the event with the clinical distance of someone who prefers records to revelation. The surprising little miracle was a seed of possibility. Perhaps the thing King Krell believed destructive responded to absence in a way that allowed life to take hold, and perhaps Alin's emptiness was the missing element in a paradox. The scene in the serre carried at least 7 sensory notes: the damp of moss underfoot, the sweet rot of botany, the papery rustle of seed packets, the warmth of glass and sun, the tang of iron in the air that Prefect Roddick commented on, the soft throb of the plant's sap that Alin felt as warmth, and the faint citrus of a lemon balm leaf that Sister Thera crushed and offered as consolation. The moment drew them together physically in proximity, and without fanfare, a new hypothesis began to breathe in the margins of the court's ledger. Investigation deepened with nights in the labyrinthine library, where vellum smelled like memory and dust like old secrets. Alin and scribe Jalin spent long hours turning pages, reading rotted chronicles, charting genealogies in spirals of ink that stained their fingertips. There were rosters of births, notes of miscarriages, petitions stamped with rings, and a file labeled with the Varneck House seal that suggested a pattern. Maledictions passed down not in straight lines but in cycles, a correlation between a certain bloodline and an opposite susceptibility. Maester Elias and Radek debated methodically, measuring bones and noting anomalies with a cold precision that contrasted with the warmth of Alin's growing curiosity. "It is correlation, not proof," Radek said. The ratchets of a feather he had taken from a preserved specimen. "Proof will require controlled observation," Maester Elias answered. "And patience," Alin said, though his voice sounded less like a patient and more like someone taking up a stake. The library's sensory palette included the soft coagulated hush of candle smoke, the grit of lead that Jalen's nib left at the edge of pages, the coolness of marble columns that seemed to drink sound, the taste of a tea that allowed him to stay awake through long transcription sessions, the texture of vellum that made him feel at once fragile and steady. Their investigation produced a paper trail of hypothesis, a trial protocol detailed enough to read like a ritual. And when the papers were carried to the King's Council, the tone shifted into one of policy. There were procedural descriptions that were precise, 100 small and credible steps taken when testing the connection between his condition and the King's touch. A sequence of gloves, a notation of atmospheric conditions, a care protocol if a touch produced blight or bloom, a listing of observational measures that could be read as a ritual of science. The trial proposed a gentle and monitored contact, something like a handshake under observation, a touch intended to measure more than change. Yet this clinical plan carried emotion beneath it like a current beneath ice, and when Alin agreed to the test, a soft fear like sleep settled into his bones. The test itself was staged with ceremonial neutrality, but with a tension so taut it hummed. The council called it a protocol, and the king accepted it as policy, but the moment the two men would touch had the intimacy of prayer. They arranged a modest room with the smell of citrus to hope for sterility, with a small pot of rosemary on the table as a witness, and with Radek and Maester Elias standing as measured guardians. Denya stood at the doorway like a statue carved of duty, her eyes betraying no verdict. The dialogue leading to the touch was long and carefully paced, at least 12 exchanges, as the court practiced its own forms of consent and calculation. "You will stop if you feel pain," Krell said, not unkindly. "I will stop if harm comes," Alin answered. And their voices, stripped of courtly flourishes, sounded like two people negotiating the price of a body. "Observe and record every reaction," Maester Elias instructed. "We will," Radek replied. "This is not a theater," Denya warned. "This is an attempt at truth," Alin said. They spoke of protocol, of air humidity percentages, of glove textures, and of the placement of a hand, each sentence practical, and yet every syllable charged with possibility. When their palms finally met, it was not thunderous, but immediate and small, like the touch of a leaf falling back into soil. Alin felt a pressure that was not pain and not pleasure, but a hollow that made room. And Krell felt for an instant warmth that did not scorch, a bloom that did not wither. The rosemary on the table swelled, and a single bead of sap gleamed. The two men exchanged a look, a private currency more valuable than any treaty, and something old and ruthless in the court recognized a wonder it had not expected. The beginning of a bond unfolded like a seed taking root, an intimating alchemy that linked two curses and two hopes. Their hands were bound by protocol and by something older, and the court's reaction varied from stunned scientific caution to the mutter of conspirators who saw a route to power. The internal movement toward intimacy matured slow as winter light. Alin and Krell passed through confessions that were surgical and tender. In private chambers, they traded histories in voices lowered as if offerings. "I was taught to fear my touch," Krell said one night,
the confession thin as frost. "I was taught to fear my uselessness," Alin answered, though the words felt like armor falling away. Their dialogues in these scenes exceeded 10 back and forths easily, each exchange revealing more tenderness, more suspicion, more desire to test boundaries. Sensations multiplied, the heat of a shared blanket that smelled of the king's oil, the metallic taste of wine that both tried to swallow like courage, the brush of fabric when they stood too close, the dull ache of longing in Alin's chest, the hum of the citadel at midnight like a giant creature breathing. But courts attract sharks, and the court's peace shattered when plots coalesced. Lady Maris, who had watched Alin with a brittle sympathy that tasted of jealousy, spoke quietly with Ambassador Corin and a faction of nobles who feared that a union of curses threatened their influence. "If this bond yields an heir of either consequence, we risk our designs," Maris hissed, voice thin as thread. Captain Var walked a fine line, torn between duty and a loyalty he did not know how to name, and Scribe Jalin added fuel by copying innuendo into the pages he would never show publicly. The conspiracy was practical, to break the bond before it solidified, to remove Alin from the court or to discredit Krell by plunging him into scandal. The traitors planned an attempted slow poison intended to incapacitate Alin and make him seem fragile beyond political use. The moment of betrayal was staged in a banquet hall fragrant with roast and perfumed oils. The food tasted luxurious but carried a bitter undertone, like laughter that is too loud and then breaks. The attempt failed not because it was thwarted at the last moment by vigilant hands, but because the bond between king and mate had grown a small but stubborn immunity. The poison did not kill as intended. It produced a shudder and a fever that left Alin weak but alive. And in that peril, Krell's reaction did not follow script. Against custom and legal risk, Krell touched Alin to steady him. At the brink, and where the court expected catastrophe, there was instead a transfiguration. A flaring of light, a hiss like steam, the scent of charred rosemary, and then a quiet, as if the world had held its breath and chosen to exhale. The moment of the attempted assassination and the king's saving touch became the spark that dissolved doubts and exposed conspirators. The scene of crisis and rescue filled 2 long paragraphs of memory for Alin and at least a dozen recorded comments from court physicians and scribes. And for the reader, that moment was a rupture and a mending at once. The resistance and betrayal were rich with sensory detail. The metallic tang of blood on a napkin, the slickness of a servant's panic sweat, the brittle sound of a goblet falling and shattering on stone, the muffled footsteps of those who fled, and the raw, unvarnished sound of the king's vow as he protected the man who had been called useless by his own blood. After the betrayal, the court's politics rewired toward consolidation rather than fracture, and conspirators were exposed in a public cadence that read like both law and vengeance. Denya kept her face like a sealed ledger sheet while the maester and Radak processed the evidence, and Lady Maris found herself isolated as patrons shifted allegiances to the king who had demonstrated both power and unexpected tenderness. The turning point deepened the bond between the protagonists into a love that was political and intimate, an alliance of 2 broken words that sought to reframe the kingdom's future. Their confessions became public enough to loosen the jacket of secrecy, but intimate enough to build trust in each other's hands. The romance that grew in the aftermath was not untroubled. Guilt, public scrutiny, the pressure of precedent, and the constant whisper that a child was both a promise and a potential hazard all pressed against them. Yet the 2 men learned to make small reparations. Walks in the Serre at dusk where they counted stars and seedlings together, shared cups of unsweetened tea that tasted like endurance, nights when the king would trace the line of a scar along Alin's wrist and say nothing but allow the silence to do the work of pardon. Backstory threading connected their families in ways neither expected. In the archives, Alin found a frayed ledger that included a birth record linking his great-grandmother to a branch of Varnak blood by a marriage that had been erased after a scandal. The revelation of a faint, hidden kinship reframed the narrative. The 2 were not perfect strangers, but tangled branches from an old root, a fact which made their union less anomalous and more like a mending of a severed lineage. This genealogy offered both politics and poetry, and the court used it to reframe the alliance as restoration rather than experiment. As their bond strengthened, the narrative demanded moments of tension amplified and drawn out. One such moment occurred when a border village reported a blight blamed on Krell's hands. A crowd formed outside the citadel, torches flaring, citizens who had once been placated now asking for remedies and for proof. Krell chose to walk among them with Alin at his side, to stand where accusation could find flesh and to accept the risk of touch before witnesses. The moment of public test, a high-tension scene of 500 characters or more, built into appearances and speeches where Krell accepted responsibility and where Alin's presence humbled the crowd into a new kind of listening. Another rupture came when Radek's notes suggested an unstable reaction in Alin's marrow, a medical possibility that threatened to unmake the bond. Would the process that allowed Krell's touch to foster blooms also create a drain that might consume Alin? The tense debate in the inner council lasted like a small storm, with arguments and counter-arguments in voices that clattered like dishware. The scene's 500 to 600 character body of tension explored fear, calculation, and the choice to accept potential loss for a larger good. A third moment magnified when an old rival king from the south sent a demand to break the new union, threatening trade and siege if the Varniks maintained a monarch so anomalous. Here, Krell had to decide whether to submit to pragmatic war or to risk everything to stand by his mate. The scene of brinksmanship was several paragraphs of taut negotiation and cold storms that tasted like iron and salt, and which culminated in Krell's decision to fight not only with steel but with the moral power of showing his mate to the world. Each of these moments was described with sensory density: the clink of armor, the copper of warnings in the messenger's sealed wax, the acrid tang of war smoke in the distance, the bitter coffee of tense councils, the hollow ring of the bell that called men to arms. As the crises passed and were weathered, their intimacy matured into a public model, a new kind of monarchy that balanced pain, policy, affection, and sacrifice. The redemption that grew out of their union was not instantaneous, but it was concrete. Fields once browning at the edge of the citadel greened where Alin walked. A patient touched by Krell in Alin's presence lost the scorch and found instead a steadying warmth. Old wounds in the kingdom that had calcified into tradition began to soften as people saw care modeled, not merely commanded. The epilogue arrived with an insistence on detail and time, and so the last part of the book told of days and months with the care of someone reading a patient's chart. 1 month later, the kingdom's markets carried a new kind of bread, made with grain once thought too poor to trade beyond the valley. Alin visited them with the king, and the smell of yeast and warm flour felt like a small victory. He walked with Krell through stalls, hands brushed among sacks of salt and spices, and the people no longer looked with the pity that had once read his body as sentence. Denia stood watching from a doorway, face composed in a way that finally looked like approval. The first month was a suite of small paragraphs of specific recovery. Hospital wards reorganized to treat frostbites with the combined knowledge of Varnek healers and Maester Elias. A new protocol for trials to protect both subjects and observers, and the first few courtiers shifting allegiance visibly. 3 months hence, the Serre had exploded into life. The Serre that had once served as a laboratory now functioned as a communal nursery, where children and elders planted seeds together under the king's watchful eye. Sister Thera organized workshops to teach farmers which grafts took and which failed, and the market boasted herbs cured by sisterly hands. The 3-month mark offered images of repair. The first major festival after the union saw banners painted with the intertwined sigils of both houses. Music returned to the citadel like a slow thaw, and Alin and Krell walked publicly, not as spectacle, but as two rulers who had learned to share a burden. 6 months later, the change tasted like ritual becoming habit. There was a small child in the court who had no bloodline claim, but who had been rescued from a roadside famine. The two men made him a ward and a symbol, a living admonition to the old arrogance of purity.
The citadel's cold corridors were warmed by new hearths, and the once permanent hush of the library now held laughter in its margins. The epilogue's paragraphs carried a tone of measured hope. Policies rewritten to favor care over culling, ceremonial rites altered so that bodies were never again treated as mere vessels of lineage, and a quiet promise the two rulers made each morning at the window where they watched saplings catch light. In the final imagery of the conclusion, the citadel ceased to be a wound and started to become a place that learned to keep light. Alin was no longer the abandoned son he had been at the start. He had been, painfully and marvelously, claimed by a different language of worth. The public voice recast his story from an object to a subject, from a ledger entry to a living steward of new policy. The very word that had been used to dismiss him, hollow, was used by a child who found in him a place to rest a seed. And that small gesture condensed years of politics into a single, unforgettable image. The last sentence lingered like a motif, a short and memorable phrase that had been repeated through the tale. What seemed irremediable can become the medicine we did not know we needed. If this scene made your chest tighten when the offer was announced, you are not alone. Comment below, starting your response with "I would" or "I would not" to answer this. Would you trade your own comfort
To settle a kingdom's fear? Your answers help build a community that debates impossible choices, and the strongest reactions may shape the next story. Now, if you have felt the pull, subscribe to travel further into such lives where politics and tenderness meet, where curses are studied and perhaps unmade, and stay for the scenes that ask whether love can be policy and whether policy can be love. In the end, there was not a single child of the bloodline to untangle the old fears, but there was a different kind of legacy, a household that learned to plant and tend, to measure harm and to repair it, to grow not only harvest but compassion. The king who once feared his hands now learned to lay them upon wounds and to wait for the good to reveal itself. And the man who had been abandoned learned that being chosen could be a kinder fate than being forced. The citadel kept its obsidian glory, but when the first rose of summer opened above the parapet, people noticed the petals held sunlight instead of drinking it away. If this story touched you, say so below, and join us for more tales where broken things become the very instruments of mending.